What counts as a catastrophe? Upon hearing the word, most people would probably think about great devastation, events that change history, and natural disasters that affect millions of people. However, who's to say that a small and contained tragedy that deeply affects the lives of a small number of people can't classify as a catastrophe? Maybe it's only a small family of 4, but their own personal calamities are still significant. We aren't denying that, but we are wondering what happens when that very particular kind of problem meets a very special kind of monster that's notoriously attracted to catastrophes. Around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, it could be safe to assume that pretty much all the natives are at least vaguely aware of the legend of the Mothman, the ominous and unexplainable creature that lurks on the innocent before a catastrophe takes place, an unfortunate event that it may or may not be connected to. Still, it is not unheard of that casual visitors, tourists, and newcomers to the area can be completely and absolutely oblivious to the infamous legend. As if this didn't already make them unfortunately vulnerable to the terrible gaze of the Mothman, what if this family came carrying a small catastrophe all for themselves in the trunk of their car, hovering over their heads like a lantern, silently becoming the presence of a dangerous and mysterious monster? The Sinclair family moved to West Virginia in a desperate time of their lives. They were used to their comfortable life in sunny California right by the beach, until everything started to go wrong. Or, at least, they were attacked by the very first wave of bad luck. The mother lost her job. The father lost his elderly mother to a heart attack. The youngest child, a boy, barely 5 years old, fell suddenly ill and needed surgery. The boy made a full recovery, unlike the economic situation of the family. With the mother still unemployed, the father was forced to beg for a raise at his job, and although he was granted his wish, to get the position he and his family would have to relocate to Mason County, West Virginia. The move to another state was a tragedy in itself for the eldest daughter, who was halfway through her first year of high school and considered the move as a life-ruining event. In a way, it wasn't too far away from the truth. Even though the family thought that moving to West Virginia was the equivalent of hitting rock bottom, their lives only continued to go downhill from there. Innocently, they thought it was only a bad luck streak. None of them imagined that these were the symptoms of a tragedy of tremendous proportions building up around them. Though one of them, had he been a little older, a little wiser, a lot more involved in the dark and supernatural legend surrounding his new home, he would have been able to, at the very least, start to genuinely fear for his family. It was the youngest child. Because, as it happened, while his father worked from dusk till dawn to sustain the family, his mother spent most of the day looking for jobs and losing them in a matter of days, and his older sister was at school or complaining about their new home locked in her bedroom, he started to spend too much time alone. He spent too much time alone with his nightmares, and his family didn't even know they were just nightmares. Their little son, with his frail health and his curious and innocent eyes, was being haunted by something mysterious, possibly malicious, and intrinsically connected to tragedy. The thing is, it did start like simple nightmares. Late one night, the little boy woke up screaming, and when his parents came running into his bedroom, they didn't understand why he would be so scared of a butterfly in the window, like the boy said. They didn't understand that he was talking about something much bigger and darker than a simple butterfly. But they left it there. Until a couple of nights later, when the little boy walked carefully out of his bedroom and sneaked into his parents' room, crying softly because the fluttering sound of a butterfly's wings didn't let him sleep. That night, he was allowed to stay with his parents. By the third time this happened, his dad went into the boy's room to look for the damned insect and found nothing. They never found any evidence of the butterfly the boy kept mentioning. Their son didn't even know the word moth yet. And just when the parents were starting to consider taking their son to a psychologist to deal with the nightmares, insecurities, trouble sleeping, hearing sensibility, phobia of butterflies, whatever it was, everything got worse. The little boy started seeing the fiery red eyes of the insect of his nightmares everywhere. It started at night, through the window, in the crack of the closet doors, sending an eerie red glow from under his bed. The little boy got tired of nobody believing in his stories, so he tried not to mention it anymore. But how could he not? How could he ignore red eyes hiding under the stairs, the fluttering of wings down the hallway when his sister was locked in her bedroom, the glowing eyes fixated on his dad's car when he got home late from work, and the sound of huge wings fluttering all around the house when his mum was frantically cleaning it, as if it was looking for a way in, searching for a vulnerable spot, trying to find the right place to attack. Eventually, the already dire situation was impossible to sustain. The daughter started getting bullied at school, and she got into a fight to defend her little brother, who cried as he claimed there was a red-eyed monster with wings waiting for her at home. The mother, frustrated beyond relief at not finding a job, entered a state of depression so grave that the only thing that pulled her out of her bed was her son's cries as he swore that a creature with glowing eyes and gigantic wings hiding under the bed was going to eat her. The father, demoralized by his family's declining emotional state, worked himself to exhaustion. Worked until he got so sick he could barely hear his young son sobbing and trying to get him to see the horrible and huge black butterfly that was perched on top of the ambulance that came to take him away. When the father saw that humanoid creature, with pitch-black limbs, demon's wings, and eyes filled with the angry red fire from hell, he had a heart attack on his way to the ambulance. Despite everything that happened up until that point, the father of that family considered himself a lucky man. Thanks to the fact that he was already getting brought up to an ambulance, he survived his non-lethal heart attack. The family reunited in the hospital and managed to take a deep breath together to get over the terrible scare and figure out a way to move on. The father explained it very simply. West Virginia wasn't their home. They'd have to do many changes, arrangements, and accommodation. There had to be a way for them to return to California. Maybe not the same house by the beach, but a safe home. That's all they needed. Nobody protested. In fact, even the youngest child stopped talking about the nightmarish creature that he used to see everywhere. His father never mentioned he saw it too. He didn't want to make things worse. He didn't want anyone in his family to feel the same excruciating pain that he felt in his heart when they were driving away from that West Virginia house forever, and he looked through the rearview mirror just in time to see that giant moth with human limbs perched on top of the rooftop of the house that had been so eager to watch them kill themselves slowly. Story 2. When it comes to encounters with supernatural creatures, most people would believe that it's all a matter of chance or bad luck. It makes sense. It is so much better to believe that those poor innocent souls that ended up haunted or traumatized for life just stumbled accidentally upon this curse. It is sort of a comfort to believe that everything happened because somebody just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Nothing more. We aren't emotionally prepared to even begin to deal with the possibility that these beings, these legends, these monsters that by all means shouldn't even be real to begin with, that they could see us, recognize us, and personally target us. It is already daunting enough to think that you could unknowingly step into the path of something that brings tragedy wherever it goes, regardless of your own involvement in the story.
This can only get worse if we stop for a second to consider the very real possibility that this entity that feeds on chaos and enables disasters could attach itself to a single person. This terrifying hypothesis was lived firsthand by a man in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, just a couple of years ago. This man, named Victor, stubbornly and decidedly avoided believing in any and all kinds of supernatural creatures, until he found himself inexplicably and unavoidably connected to one of them. He didn't know it at first. He didn't even suspect it. In fact, he disliked the subject so much that he couldn't have even known enough information about the particular beast taunting him to understand what was going on. It started very simply, as simple as a little bit of rain, and it would have taken something extremely superstitious to think it could have been anything other than bad luck. Victor was in the process of buying a new car, and all he had to do was deliver a set of very important papers signed to an office. It was even a place close to home, so he decided to walk. It was a beautiful day, and no one even considered the possibility of rain, until, in the blink of an eye, Victor saw a couple of raindrops fall on the papers in his hands. He started walking faster, but it was useless. In a matter of seconds, the few raindrops turned into something close to a storm. It was ridiculously unexpected, as if a dark cloud had opened up out of nowhere on top of him. The signed papers were ruined, and Victor was soaked from head to toe by the time he returned home. But there was something else he couldn't get out of his mind. It was the sound of some heavy wings fluttering above him, almost but not quite drowned by the sound of the rain, as if they were only following him, and only him. That first little incident was the first to plant a seed of unease on Victor's mind. But of course he didn't think more of it. Not until he was a victim of the second tragedy. He had finally gotten his new car, and it was the very first time he had to fill its tank. He approached the station slowly and casually, until something strange caught his eye. It was late in the day when the sun was almost gone and the shadows around town were pulled in strange directions. But what he saw just couldn't have been another shadow. Right there, standing too tall to successfully hide behind the gas pump, there was... Well, Victor couldn't really explain it. His first instinct was to think it was a man, but who could be that tall? Who could have such wide shoulders? Who could wear a huge and heavy coat on such a warm day? And were those red sunglasses? The image was so bewildering that Victor got distracted and lost control of the steering wheel for a second. If it weren't for another car honking at him and a service station worker stepping in front of the vehicle right on time to wave his arm wildly and catch Victor's attention, he would have crashed against the gas pump and undoubtedly created a disaster. But here's the real problem. That wasn't the end of the story. Victor thought he had narrowly avoided a tragedy, and he tried to go on with his day, fill the car's tank, and move on. The strange figure that he saw hiding in the shadows was nowhere to be seen. He had nothing to worry about. But right when he was pulling into the street, he heard it again. The fluttering of large and heavy wings was like something that could have only come out of a movie, a flying dinosaur or a monster. And yet Victor could hear it so close as if the thing was fluttering inside his own skull. He looked out his window, all around his car, and through the rearview mirror. He was frantic, desperate for an explanation. But just when he thought he saw a hint of a shadow crossing the rapidly darkening sky well above his car, he heard the crash. His distraction cost him a lot. He ended up crashing the car against another of them and doing nothing wrong but going down the street. It was embarrassing. It was a shame. It was deeply unsettling. That night changed a lot of things for Victor. He didn't want to even consider something supernatural going on around him, but how could he not? How could he forget the ominous figure he saw standing in the shadows? How could he erase from his mind the sound of those unnatural wings flapping in the air above his head? He tried. He really tried. But even after he got the car back from the mechanic, he couldn't quite bring himself to get it out of the garage. Every time he turned it on, he'd hear the humming of insects, butterflies, moths. He didn't know a lot, but he knew car engines weren't supposed to sound like that. Every time he saw a car's red lights, he'd be haunted by a memory he couldn't quite piece together. And every night he would be plagued by strange nightmares where he died again and again and again. Eventually, Victor managed to talk himself out of what he thought were irrational fears. His logical mind told him he had nothing to fear. There wasn't a creature haunting him and waiting for him to get in his car and lead him to a tragedy. He pulled himself out of bed one night after waking up from one of the worst nightmares yet, and told himself that it was now or never. He got in his car. He ignored the goosebumps he felt when he heard an insect fluttering nearby. He moved past the nausea that assaulted him at the first sight of red lights like devil eyes staring at him, and he drove on and on until he couldn't ignore his company anymore. It was standing in the corner, staring at him like a pitch-black statue. It was perched on rooftops and tragic lights like an ominous gargoyle. It flew past him in the sky with wings bigger than any known animal. It taunted him. It warned him. Victor started screaming, yelling at that terrible vision to leave him alone, but nothing was enough. Finally, he lost control. He couldn't take it anymore. He didn't want unexplainable creatures to be real. So now that he was facing one, he had to end with it. The next time that he pulled into a sleepy neighborhood and saw the horrifying silhouette of that moth-like animal creeping at him from the house's lawn, Victor sped up the car. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, he gritted his teeth, and he made the car go as fast as he could, until he crashed against the wall of the house. No body, no monster, not a single sign of any kind of creature ran over by his car. And, of course, no reasonable explanation for anything that happened that night. When Victor got out of hospital, he was arrested. He served a short sentence for damaging private property without a reason. Of course, he never told anyone what he saw or what he thought he did that day. He wasn't sure if he really killed that vision that haunted him for days. If he failed, at least he was at peace knowing that his few broken bones must have been enough of a tragedy, enough of an offering for the nightmare to leave him alone. Story 3. Believing in the supernatural has always been appealing to people. Hundreds of years ago, it was necessary, as it was the only way to explain things that we didn't yet understand. But, even now, in the age of science and logic, this kind of thing hasn't completely lost its charm. We are all intrigued by magic, and we are hopeful about miracles. But we are also fearsome of things beyond our understanding, and threats we aren't prepared to fight. However, we all deal with this sort of thing in many different ways. There are skeptics and fanatics and everything in between. This story in particular is a very special case when a fanatic and a skeptic collide, and not just anywhere in the world, but in a zone that will test both of their beliefs and put their lives at risk. It's well known that around the world, some places are more famous than others when it comes to encounters with extraordinary creatures. Could be coincidences, could be media manipulation, or it could very well be a powerful concentration of inexplainable energies in that area. There's a very specific story about a dark and mysterious creature, a bad omen with a moth's wings and a human size that lurks around Point Pleasant, following or possibly sparking up tragedies for helpless humans. This creature and the despicable energy it carries have spread beyond contention. and the legend has stretched its limbs all over the world. Still, we must go back to West Virginia to hear a harrowing tale about this monster. It was bound to happen that, in the extensive array of tales of encounters with this entity collected around the world, eventually the creature's penchant for tragedy would meet its match with humanity's passion for solidarity. In this case, we are talking about two members of the fire department. On one hand, there was Otto, probably the oldest member of the team, who appeared even older because of his anxious, superstitious, and kind personality that reminded his colleagues of their grandfathers. On the other hand, there was Miguel, a newcomer to the department who immediately felt respect and affection for the older man that didn't let his fears stop him from being the first one to jump into danger to help civilians. And then, in the background, waiting for them in the shadows of every tragedy scheduled for the future, there was the Mothman. When Miguel joined the fire department and was warned for the first time against the superstitions in the area, he didn't think it would be much of a problem until he officially met Otto. As soon as they started working together, Miguel was able to confirm that every time they attended a job, Otto would do his job expertly, sure, but he would also go out of his way to scout the area around the building on fire or anything like that, searching for something. Miguel tried not to pay too much attention and let Otto deal with his superstitions however he pleased. This meant that Otto would nervously check the fire truck, the sky above them, the shadowy alleyway, and any place where a malicious entity could be hiding. Fortunately, he never found anything. Until, one fateful day, that would change everything for them. That day, the fire department got a call to deal with a building on fire. It was worse than usual, but it wasn't anything they hadn't dealt with before. Otto went through the same routine of being overly careful and looking for things that weren't there. But when the fire truck finally parked in front of their destination, Otto screamed. It started as a gasp of genuine surprise, but then utter terror seized his heart and he started screaming. Everyone turned toward him. Nobody could understand what could have shaken an experienced firefighter like him so badly. His desperate yell was heartbreaking to his colleagues' ears, but then he kept gasping for air, shaking, and his eyes filled with tears as he struggled to speak, to breathe, to scramble away from that godforsaken place. Only Miguel, who had grown closer to Otto than most people in the department, tried to help him for a moment before rushing to go to work. It was an emergency. They really had to deal with the building on fire, but Miguel couldn't let his colleague have a heart attack right in front of him and do nothing. He tried to calm him down from his panic attack, but it was useless. Paramedics that had arrived at the site as well were coming over to help, but Otto managed to say something of the utmost importance and urgency to the young man in front of him. "It was in the window," he said. "It's inside the building. I finally saw it." That was more than enough for Miguel, who immediately understood. After so many years of being careful for everyone else's sake, Otto had finally locked eyes with the being that terrified him enough to paralyze him in the moment of truth. Miguel couldn't stay behind another second. He had to follow all his fellow firefighters and barge inside the building, save as many people as they could, and put down the fire as fast as humanly possible. But it wasn't enough. It was the most difficult job of his life, and he would never forget the stress, the fear, and the violence of it all. The building was dark with smoke, hot as hell, and crumbling down with every passing second. Miguel and his colleagues worked as best as they could, but they weren't alone. Miguel swore he wasn't superstitious. He promised himself he wouldn't let Otto's fantasies get into his head. And yet, around every corner he turned, under the stairs, in otherwise empty rooms crawling on the rooftop, he saw that thing everywhere. red eyes as bright and fiery as the fire, gigantic wings that encourage the flames with the smallest of flutters. Just a heavy and ominous lump of pure darkness sneaking all over the building, hiding the victims, spreading the fire, and breaking down the walls until there was nothing else anyone could have done. All the firefighters walked out of that building devastated. It was never an easy day when there was a casualty, but there was something different about that job. The tragedy felt different, targeted somehow, and it was only made worse by the fact that one of their own, Otto, lost his life due to a heart attack before even stepping inside the building. Everyone involved would talk about that event for a long time, but nobody would be as affected and changed by it like Miguel. Since that day, the change happened slowly, but it was impossible to stop. Miguel, without even realizing what he was doing at first, took Otto's place. He became nervous and superstitious. He looked everywhere he went. He stared too hard at dark corners. He checked every window before entering a building. He lived his life and worked as hard as everyone else. But he was always searching, always waiting for the day he would end up just like Otto did. Before I continue to the next story, I just want to say thank you for choosing to watch this video, and I hope you're enjoying my narration. I did want to take a little moment to apologize for the way my voice sounds. I've had the flu recently and I'm only just recovering. If you are enjoying this video, please don't forget to smash that like button, and if you don't already, subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out, especially since YouTube seems to be suppressing my channel these days. Thank you. Story 4. It might come as a surprise for most people how often a horror story begins with something completely different. A love story, a moment of happiness, a promising beginning. So many of the most horrifying stories started out as something good and hopeful and even joyful. It's only halfway through that these tales begin to sour, that people get corrupted, places become haunted, and monsters wake up. This is more than a mere coincidence. As it happens when we are comfortable and happy, when we feel safe and loved as humans, we tend to lower our guard. We put down our defenses, we become more vulnerable, and we miss the signs and the red flags. And then we pay the price for our naivety. Another factor that usually comes into play is the way we act around other people. Some people might become protective when they're surrounded by their loved ones, but usually we feel so at home that we can be easily distracted and even foolish. After all, it's easy to make mistakes when you're laughing with your best friends. That is exactly what happened to a group of friends that rented a cabin in the forest to spend a weekend together. They expected drinks, fun, and in the worst-case scenario, a little bit of drama. Never in their wildest dreams did any of them expect to be haunted by their presence that surrounded tragedy everywhere it landed, with those unforgiving glowing red eyes and those bat-like wings that were bigger than an average person. But the journey toward the cabin was an adventure in itself. There were 6 friends, all in their 20s, and eager to relax for a weekend from their jobs, their studies, and their lives. When they arrived at the cabin, some of them were already a little drunk, and all of them were having a good time. Until one of the women screamed. They were all crowded in front of the cabin. Some of them were still pulling out their bags from the car, and one of the women stopped suddenly on her way to the cabin. She was tense like a statue and suddenly pale. Her scream was so loud and frightened that some birds took flight from the nearby trees. Her friends rushed to her side in worry, but it just didn't make sense. She claimed and promised and swore that she saw someone moving inside the cabin. But the place was locked and nobody else saw anything. The group entered the cabin carefully, and they searched every room, but found nothing. The young woman was utterly confused. She was absolutely certain that she saw an absurdly large silhouette moving inside. It looked like a ridiculously tall and burly man, probably a bear, and yet it left no trace of its presence. Her friends were great at distancing her from the incident, and an hour later they were already joking about her panicked scream, until it happened again. And this time, she wasn't the only one who experienced it. The group was in the kitchen, serving drinks and snacks generously, talking loudly and enjoying themselves. Then, a sound made a few heads turn to look at the window. But none of them were quick enough. None of them except the same young woman from before who screamed in absolute terror. But just when her friends were starting to tease her about being too nervous and seeing things again, one of the other women spoke up. She hadn't screamed, but that didn't mean she wasn't as startled as the other one. We all react to being scared differently, and this other young woman turned pale as a ghost, and she started shaking so badly that one of her friends had to hold her up and then help her sit down before she'd end up falling on the floor. It was an absolute shock for the others to hear the two girls agree on what they'd seen. A big black mass knocked against the window for maybe half a second, but long enough to catch a flash of red. A light? Eyes? Blood? Neither of them could really tell, but that didn't make them any less scared. To help them, their friends, emboldened by alcohol and finding strength in numbers, went out of the cabin to search for a strange animal or even stranger animal possibly taunting them, but found nothing. By the time they returned, it was pitch black outside, and after a few drinks, dinner, and some games to lighten up the mood, almost everyone went to bed feeling as happy and relaxed as the second they arrived. But then there were the two women that saw the creature. No matter how much they drank or how hard they tried to just forget about it, relax, and go to bed, they couldn't fall asleep. It was like every time they closed their eyes, they saw a slash of red across the window like a warning. And every time they stayed still for too long, they felt a cold breeze like the feather-like caress of wings over their arms. Eventually, they couldn't take it anymore. They started talking to each other in whispers and agreed that they heard something moving in the living room of the cabin. An insect, they thought at first, sure that they could hear a moth's wings fluttering blindly against the ceiling. But then they were certain they heard footsteps, and that was enough to send them jumping out of bed in fright. They were quick to wake up their friends, and although most of them dismissed their fears and even laughed at their impossible theories, they were inevitably dragged to the living room, where they watched in bone-chilling horror as the fire consumed the cabin right in front of their eyes. It was wild, it was unexplainable, and it was a tragedy. They didn't know how the fire could have started or how they couldn't have heard a thing until it was almost too late. By the time they managed to wake up all of them, the last few had to jump through windows or fire and come out with cuts or burns. And most of their belongings were lost to the sudden and hungry fire that devoured the little building in the forest. None of them could remember the bad omens that only a few of them managed to catch. Was that creepy figure a warning or an announcement of the inevitable? Was it all a coincidence? The answers, if there were any, burned away with the entire cabin. Thank you for watching this video. I know there's a ton of content out there, and I'm really appreciative of you watching this right through to the end. Don't forget, if you haven't already, smash that like button and subscribe to my channel. If you want to support me further, go ahead and check out my Ko-fi account where you can buy me a coffee as a tip. Thanks again.